Now imagine this situation with me. It's a Saturday afternoon. Your stomach's growling a little bit. And so you go to the fridge to get a little snack. You know, it's a healthy snack, of course. And as you're rummaging through the fridge, you hear a knock at the door. Now you don't really think too much of it because you know the UPS guy's coming. You know, he's got those Christmas packages, those Amazon orders. And so you go back to finding that snack, but then you hear another knock. You know, in this day and age, who knocks on the door, you know? Who is this? So you look through your door, you got a little piece of glass, and you see that it's two people who are dressed in very nice clothes. And they have some literature in their hands. Maybe even one person holding a Bible. And you think to yourself, oh, Christians. They're coming to share the gospel. How wonderful. You open the door and you exchange greetings. And these people, they're talking about Jesus. And as you're talking with them, the conversation goes in a very odd direction. They begin talking about Jesus, but it's not in a way that you understand. It's not in a way that you've been taught. They're using the same term that we might use, but they say that Jesus is the firstborn of all creation. Okay, you think about that. That's in the Bible, so we agree with that. But then they say that Jesus was created. That he himself is Michael, the archangel. So you just don't know what to do with this. And so you say, well, where in the Bible does it teach this? Where in the Bible does it teach this? And they show this verse. Go ahead and show this. Go ahead and show the verse. First slide. Thank you. They show this verse. So let's read it. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was a God. Huh? And then you ask, well, what translation are you using? And they say, well, I'm using the New World Translation. Yeah, it's otherworldly. It's an otherworldly translation. And so you kind of think on the fly, maybe you've not experienced this before. You know, they're so close to the truth, right? Talking about Jesus, but they go in the opposite direction by talking about the wrong Jesus. Now, in this hypothetical, these are Jehovah's Witnesses who have come to your door and they're seeking to evangelize for the sake of Jehovah. Now, this translation, I tend to not talk about translations because they're not the differences between them are not significant. We have so many good translations, and virtually all of them are excellent. Except this one. And if you do any research about this translation committee, who exactly is on the translation committee of the New World Translation, if you go back to the first edition, most of the people who were on the committee don't even know Greek and Hebrew. Right? So you know you're getting off to a bad start there. Can you go ahead and show the next slide? So I looked up how Bible Hub is a very helpful website, and I typed in John 1:1 in Bible Hub, and this is what I got. Now at the bottom are abbreviations for all of the different translations that we probably have here, the ESV. We use this one, but I want you to see the consensus here. See this consensus? Whenever you see this type of consensus, this is the interpretation that we should have. And so if there's one translation that's sticking way out here and communicating something very different, that should be a sign to you that, hey, that's not the correct translation. Now, why do I bring this up? Well, we're going to be diving into John 1:1 here soon. But for our theme this morning, we're talking about Advent. And we just sang the song, O Come, All Ye Faithful. Now, in the second verse, which tends to be a neglected verse, even our hymnal doesn't have the second verse we sang, but we sang it this morning. That verse goes like this: God of God, light of light eternal, he abhors not the virgin's womb, very God, begotten, not created. So what this hymn is doing is it is highlighting, let me pose it as a question. What doctrine is this hymn highlighting? It begins with N, and it ends in carnation. Not a flower. Incarnation. The incarnation. When we go to Easter, we celebrate Jesus' death and his resurrection. But when we go to Christmas, we celebrate the virgin birth and the incarnation. Now, the cross and the manger are intimately connected. You cannot arrive at the cross without beginning with the manger. You cannot understand who Jesus is, what he has done, independent of understanding who he is. Jesus' person, the manger, and Jesus' work, the cross, go hand in hand. So we want to make a big deal about the incarnation. A real big deal. And to help us see this, we're going to start in 1 John 4. We're going to begin reading in verse 1. And brothers and sisters, before we jump in, the burden of this morning, is that you would go away being more convinced that Jesus is both God and man. Having a modest goal. We're going to do some application, but the burden of this morning's sermon is going to be teaching. Conveying to you what the Bible teaches about who Jesus is. And then we'll have application of the Lord's Supper. Beginning in verse 1 in John 4. Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God. For many false prophets have gone out into the world. By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. And every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. So a little context here. John is writing to the early church. And in the early church, there are people going around preaching about Jesus. Right? In the early church, there are preachers knocking on people's doors. Just like today. And John has a concern. He has a concern that everyone knocking on a door, everybody preaching Jesus, isn't really preaching Jesus. And this is an insight that we have to maintain. The same is true today. And so John gives a test case. So when someone comes to your door and they proclaim to you Jesus Christ, this is the test that John gives us to discern whether they are of God or whether they are of the devil. Verse 2, by this we know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. So I want to take this statement and boil it down, paraphrase it in a different way. But before we do that, we have to look at this verb, has come. Has come. Has come is a perfect verb. That's the tense. It's also a perfect verb, but the tense is perfect. Has come suggests that Jesus has done something, but the doing of that action, he exists before he did that. In other words, Jesus existed before he became flesh. Has come is suggesting that before he became flesh, he existed. He was doing something before he became flesh. So this is suggesting that Jesus existed before the incarnation. This is suggesting Jesus' pre-existence. Jesus has always existed. Now it says in the flesh. This is referring to the moment of Jesus' conception. So virgin birth. And virgin birth segues to the incarnation. So in other words, we might paraphrase this passage by saying this. Every spirit that confesses the incarnation of Jesus Christ is from God. Every spirit that confesses the incarnation of Jesus Christ is from God. That's what John is saying. And in the early church, they believed that Jesus pre-existed. However, there was debate about his incarnation. They think that Jesus, these false teachers would teach that Jesus he floated around as a ghost, right? He had the image of flesh, but he himself did not have a real body. So the incarnation is critical. Now let's say you do not confess the incarnation. What would John say of that individual? Verse 3. And every spirit, or every person, or every angelic or demonic spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. Now we have to drill down and ask what type of Jesus John is referring to. Does that make sense? The Jesus of verse 3 cannot be understood without the Jesus of verse 2. The Jesus of verse 2 is the incarnate God. For someone to deny the incarnation, John is saying that person has the spirit of the Antichrist. John is drawing a line. John is drawing a line in the sand. He's saying on this side are Christians, and on this side are non-Christians. What is the line? It's the incarnation. It's the incarnation. To be a Christian is to confess that Jesus is both God and man. And to deny that is to put oneself on the other side of the line, on the side of the Antichrist, the devil, and sin. Now there's an objection to this, and the objection is this. Well, Pastor, what about children? To be a Christian, it's very simple. It's very simple. All you have to do is believe that Jesus died for your sins. And I want to celebrate that simplicity. I want to celebrate that. I want to say amen to that. But the gospel it's like a pool. And in this pool, there's a shallow end. And then in this pool, there's a deep end. You can get into the pool by hanging out in the shallow end. And that's where children play. Children are in the shallow end. But the shallow end is not in exclusion to the deep end. They're both a part of the pool. Now, as we swim, and Lord willing, this is the point of the Christian life. If we're in our 30s and we're still wearing floaties, and we're still in the shallow end, something's off. So as we mature in the faith, what we do is we start in the shallow end, and we begin swimming in the deep end. And it's in the deep end where this confession arises. So yes, one can be saved by simply believing that Jesus died for one's sins. The simplicity of the gospel is there. But the pool has a deep end as well. And the encouragement is to swim from this side to that side. And as we go over here, we see that there are boundaries. There are rules that the apostles give us. And one of the rules is that we must confess that Jesus Christ is God. And we can't deny that. So that's John's point here. And that's the point that I want to belabor, and that's the point that I want to give us. I want us to have certain hard lines of doctrine. Clear lines. And this would be one of them. Now, John has a lot more to say about the incarnation. And he says a lot to us in John 1:1. Let's turn there. So in 1 John 4, John gives us the boundaries. And in John 1, John exposits for us, explains to us what exactly the incarnation is. John 1. And brothers and sisters, as I preface this exposition of John 1:1 and then John 1:14, I will say that this is some of the most technical language in the New Testament we have from the apostles. John 1:1 and John 1:14 reveal to us mysteries that are very difficult to grasp. And so we're entering into a conversation that the Bible gives us about the Trinitarian God. So I will say that what John teaches us is challenging. And I do want to end by ending in the shallow end, but swimming in the deep end is important. And by God's grace, I'll help you see this passage in a little bit clearer way. John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This simple sentence packs in for us profound truth. In the beginning. So when is John writing? What beginning is John referring to? Like the beginning of his day or something different? When John writes in the beginning, he writes in arche. In arche. When you read Genesis 1:1 in the Greek translation, you know what it says? In arche. John is picking up his commentary about who Jesus is, and he's not talking about Jesus from John's point of view. He's talking about Jesus from Moses' point of view in Genesis 1:1. So John is reaching back to the very beginning of time. John is saying that in Genesis 1:1, before the world was, the Word was. John is saying before the world was, the Word was. And the Word was with God. Now this with is not a geographical with. Because before the world began, there was no geography. This is saying that Jesus Christ had a unique relationship with the Father. It's said that someone asked Augustine, what was God doing before he created the world? And it's said that Augustine responded, he was creating hell for people who ask those types of questions. Now, I don't think Augustine really said that. And if he did, he's wrong, because John is answering the question for us. What was God doing before the world began? What God was doing is he was in perfect fellowship with himself. With God is referring to the unique relationship between Son and Father before creation began, in which the Son and the Father had perfect union, perfect love, perfect fellowship. And it's out of that love that God created the world and he created you. But God didn't need us. You know, the relationship with God that we have with God is not a two-way street. You know, we need him and he doesn't need us. Before we were, God was doing just fine. And the Son was with the Father forever and ever and ever. He had a unique relationship with God. The Word had a unique relationship with God. Now, as we pivot to this last clause, you see the word God in the second clause, and the Word was with God. That term is theos. The same term, theos, shows up in the next clause, and the Word was God. The theos in the second clause is referring to the Father. The first God is referring to the Father. So the Word was with God. Jesus had unique fellowship with the Father. Now, as we segue to the third clause, John uses the same term, theos, but it's not referring to the Father. Clear as mud? The theos in the third clause is referring to what the Father and the Son share. What is it they share? They share deity. They share divinity. So when John says the Word was God, he is not saying that Jesus was the Father. That would be incorrect. What he's saying is that Jesus was divine. He had the essence of God. He and the Father share a common essence. And so that Jesus is not the Father. Jesus has always existed. Jesus has a special relationship with the Father, but Jesus himself is not the Father, but shares with the Father divinity. Weaving this thread is very challenging. And this is the key. The key is to understand the reference to God in John 1:1. There's two different references. The first is to the Father. The second is to deity. Now let's jump to 1:14. Here we see the Word showing up again. The Word has always existed. The Word has a unique relationship with the Father, and the Word himself is divine. And then we have this statement in verse 14. And the Word became flesh. And the Word became flesh. Once again, another key passage. Now, I want us to observe the verb. Is the verb was? Does it say, and the Word was flesh? Is it is, and the Word is flesh? No. This is not a verb of being. This is a verb of becoming. The Word was God, but he became flesh. In other words, the incarnation did not add to Jesus anything that he needed. The incarnation was the addition to his divinity of a full humanity. And so that in the manger, what you see is the perfect union in a single person of deity and humanity. That there's no overlap, right? This isn't like that the circles overlap. The circles touch, but they don't overlap, and they're certainly not absorbed into each other. And John is saying that this Word, who became flesh, who himself was the Creator, dwelt among the people in the first century. And the reason why this is so important, the reason why this doctrine is so important, is Jesus' glory hinges on his identity. When John says, "And we have seen his glory," what type of glory is John referring to? Is he referring to the glory of humanity? Is Jesus saying that is John saying that Jesus was simply a really, 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 really good person? Is this the glory of a human being? Or is this the glory of some type of demigod? Right, that's a category as well, the Jehovah's Witnesses. Right, Jesus was the archangel Michael. Those are options that people take. But that's not what the Bible teaches. The glory of Jesus Christ, what makes Jesus so important, is that he is God in the flesh. And so that this is why he can be full of grace and truth. The reason why Jesus can save us is because he has become like us, died on our behalf, and himself was God. The whole logic of the Christian faith hinges on this idea. And it is both worth proclaiming, celebrating, and understanding. So summarizing what we're saying, summarizing what this passage is teaching. It is teaching truths that I feel in my heart I hit a ceiling, you know? You ever hit the gas pedal real hard and your rev limiter, ding, ying, ying, ying. Now I feel like that's the territory we're in with this passage. And it's difficult to communicate these truths. Maybe these truths are easily more felt than communicated. And so I rack my brain, Lord, how would you have this passage applied? You know, these are all great ideas, but how does it impact my life? And this was the thought that I had, and this is the thought that I'd like us to reflect on when we partake of communion. In life, we have a choice. We have a choice to where we will find identity and value. We have a choice regarding what it is that we place worth on. What are we going to see as worthy? All of us are drawn to worth. All of us are drawn to something outside of ourselves. And the pull and the appeal is the worth that those objects have. Making this real simple. In life, we have the decision between finding identity, value, and worth in sin or in God. When we think about our sin in light of Christ, sin becomes very, very trivial. Very trivial. As I sin, which I do often, as I sin and I study this passage, I would think to myself, how on earth could I sin? How on earth could I choose this when the value and the glory and the preeminence of Jesus Christ is for me? How can we choose a life of disobedience when Jesus is this worthy? Imagine him being in the room. You know, the whole world would flock to him, just trying to touch him. Magi from the east, wise men, would come and lay their treasures at his feet. A babe. This man grew up and then was pierced on a cross for our sins. What can compete with him? In our life, for our heart's allegiance, what on earth would we put before him? Only a fool would choose to celebrate the pleasures of sin instead of the eternal glory of the God-man crucified for our sins.